What if I told you that the story of humanity did not begin with chaos, but with purpose? That the world was not born by chance, but was carefully designed to reflect order, beauty, and life. The book of Genesis is more than an ancient record. It is the script of our very existence. In it we see creation emerge in perfection, but we also witness the fall, corruption, and judgment. At the same time, every page beats with a promise. God never abandoned his plan to save. This storyline is counterintuitive. The more humanity drifts away, the closer God draws near. While we build towers of pride, he raises covenants of hope. While brothers kill each other out of envy, he opens paths to reconciliation. While the earth is filled with violence, he raises an ark to preserve life. It is almost ironic, isn't it? Man insists on breaking, and God insists on restoring. And perhaps this is the great paradox. What looks like defeat is, in truth, part of a greater plan. Out of pain comes a new beginning. From abandonment rises a promise. From Joseph's pit springs the throne of Egypt. It is a continuous thread that stretches across centuries and reaches us today. A message that speaks not only about them, but about you and me, here and now. Because if he was able to turn tragedy into redemption back then, why wouldn't he do the same today? Here begins the journey. From creation to salvation, from Adam to Joseph, a voyage that will challenge the way you see life, reveal hidden secrets, and ignite in you the faith to live the extraordinary. If this content has already stirred your curiosity, don't wait. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this journey. In the beginning, when everything was still silence and emptiness, God brought into existence what no one could have imagined. Creation did not begin with haste, but with order and beauty. He said, "Let there be light," and the darkness surrendered. It is like when you decide to bring order into your own life, a messy desk, for example. Once you organize it, you realize there is room for new ideas. That was the beginning as well. Chaos gave way to purpose, and life took the stage in the theater of the universe. As the earth was formed, mountains rose and seas spread out. A spectacle of divine creativity took shape. In every detail, there was intention. Have you ever noticed how even today the colors of a sunset look as if painted by an artist? That same hand-shaped rivers, trees and animals, everything had its function, like a great puzzle in which each piece fits into a greater purpose. It was as if nature itself whispered a secret. Nothing was made by chance. And then came the climax, the human being, made from dust, yet carrying within the breath of life. This reminds us that, though simple on the outside, we were created for something extraordinary. It is like someone born in a small town, but with the potential to influence the entire world. The detail is that this creation was not merely physical, but also relational. God formed men and women to walk in communion with him, to reflect his character in the world. If we observe carefully, everything that exists today still carries the mark of that beginning. The curiosity of a child, the strength of a lion, the cycle of the seasons, all are signs of this creation. And when we think about practical life, it becomes clear. If God was able to organize nothingness and transform it into something beautiful, can he not also bring order to our inner being? How often do we feel in confusion, like a dark room without windows? Yet a single beam of light is enough to change everything. And in this perfect setting, the next scene of the story arises. The garden, full of harmony, communion, and beauty. A place where every detail had purpose, but which also carried both an invitation and a boundary. For where there is creation, there is also freedom. Imagine a garden where every color was more vivid than any artist's palette, where the air was not only breathed, but felt like an embrace. That was Eden. Adam and Eve were not merely surrounded by beauty, they lived in full communion with God. There was no fear, no rush, no pain. It was like that rare moment when you manage to turn off your phone and simply enjoy a quiet afternoon with someone you love, only multiplied 1,000 times. In this place, everything was available: succulent fruits, crystal clear rivers, animals of every kind. It was creation at its peak, every detail designed to sustain life. Yet there was also a clear command: do not eat from the fruit of a specific tree. It is curious to think how even in the midst of abundance there is a boundary. It is like when you receive a credit card with a high limit. The freedom is real, but if used recklessly, it can become a prison. Eden reminds us that true freedom walks hand in hand with responsibility. The relationship between the Creator and the first human beings was so intimate that the Bible describes God as walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Think about that. The very author of life strolling side by side with his creation. It was not a cold religion. It was closeness, an invitation to live in harmony not only with him, but also with the world around. And that invitation still echoes today. Every time we pause to pray, to meditate on the Word, or even to contemplate a sunrise. It is fascinating how Eden reflects what every human being still seeks today: wholeness, peace, balance. Some try to find it in success, others in travel, and some even in relationships. But what Adam and Eve had in the garden was deeper. It was purpose. And deep down, every human heart still longs for that same state of peace. Modern life, with its deadlines and notifications, tries to steal it away. But all it takes is slowing down to remember we were created to live for something greater than the daily rush. Yet and here the plot begins to take another shade. Where there is freedom, there is also choice, and choices bring consequences. The perfect garden held not only the beauty of the promise, but also the possibility of the fall. In the heart of Eden, where everything seemed perfect, the voice of the serpent arose, cunning and persuasive. It was not a frontal attack, but a subtle distortion of the truth. Temptation rarely comes with the face of danger. More often it presents itself as something attractive, almost logical. Who has never been deceived by a good opportunity that in the end only brought headaches? That is what happened there. A promise of knowledge that concealed the weight of the fall. Eve listened, pondered, and gave in. Adam, who should have protected and judged the situation with clarity, simply joined in. The fruit appeared beautiful, desirable, irresistible. It is striking how even today we repeat the same pattern. What seems like just a simple choice can turn into a chain. It is like when someone decides to just try a debt, an addiction, a shortcut, and suddenly discovers that peace is gone. The mistake did not begin with the bite, but with the dialogue with what should have been rejected. With the fall, the entire world changed its color. Communion with God was broken. The human heart was filled with fear and shame. That garden, once a home, became a place of memory for what was lost. And from that day on, every man and woman carries within themselves the echo of this story. Misused freedom has a high price. It is as if life reminds us, with every stumble, that our choices are never isolated. They always leave marks. And yet, even in this setting of disobedience, a hidden promise was present. God not only judged the serpent and announced the consequences, but also left a seed of hope. A descendant would come who would crush the serpent's head. In other words, even when everything seemed lost, there was already a plan to save. This tension, fall and promise, pain and hope runs through the entire story of humanity. And it is in this rhythm of choices that shape destinies that the next scene unfolds. Two brothers standing before God, bringing their offerings, yet carrying within themselves very different intentions. Right after the fall, humanity already revealed the marks of a divided heart. Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, grew up in a world that already knew pain, yet still carried the memory of the promise. Each brought an offering before God, Abel gave the best of his flock, while Cain brought fruits of the land. The gesture seemed simple, but it revealed something profound. The act of creation requires not only effort, but also heart. Have you noticed how, even in our daily lives, two people can do the same thing, yet one does it with love and the other out of mere obligation? The result is never the same. God accepted Abel's offering, but rejected Cain's. This was not about fruit or meat, but about attitude. Instead of reflecting and judging himself, Cain let envy grow. And envy is treacherous. It begins as a whisper, and if not mastered, turns into a shout. It is like that co-worker who never celebrates another's victory and begins to live in an invisible race of comparison. Cain failed to realize that the true enemy was not beside him, but within him. God, in his mercy, warned Cain, "Sin is crouching at your door, but you must rule over it." It was like receiving a red warning light on the car's dashboard. Ignore it, and the problem only gets worse. But Cain did not listen. Driven by rage, he lured Abel into the field and killed him. It was the first murder in history, a brutal shock against the promise of life. The soil, once fertile to bear fruit, was now stained with blood. The fall took on deeper contours, a brother rising against his own brother. When God confronted Cain, his reply was cold. "Am I my brother's keeper?" That question still echoes today. How many times does society repeat the same when it turns its eyes away from the suffering of others? Whether ignoring a beggar on the street or turning one's back on a friend in crisis, it is as if the spirit of Cain still seeks to whisper. Yet God's promise remained. There was still a plan to save, even though the human heart insisted on straying away. And so humanity began to multiply, but also to corrupt itself. What started with envy and blood soon spread, turning entire families into settings of violence and opening the way for greater judgment. Time passed, and the sons of Adam multiplied across the earth, but along with the creation of families and cities came the spread of wickedness. The human heart, stained by the fall, began to drown in violence and arrogance. It was as if Cain's envy had spread on a large scale. What should have been a world filled with promise and life became a stage for disputes, injustice, and oppression. Anyone who looks at today's headlines can easily understand the picture. Wars, corruption, betrayals. It seems the story keeps repeating itself. God, who had judged Cain with justice, now looked upon all humanity and saw hardened hearts. Men had traded closeness with the Creator for fleeting pleasures. It was like someone who inherits a beautiful house but abandons it, letting weeds overgrow and walls collapse. Creation, which had been born to reflect order and beauty, now groaned under the weight of sin. The desire to save seemed distant, yet the promise still lingered in silence, waiting for the right moment to blossom. The Bible describes that every imagination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. This shows that corruption was not only external, but internal. The problem was not just in wars or visible violence, but in the mind, in desires, and in choices. Have you noticed how sometimes the greatest battle does not happen outside, but within us? It is the struggle to forgive, to resist answering in anger, to fight the temptation of taking the easy path. And in this heavy atmosphere, hope seemed to vanish. But God always preserves a remnant, someone willing to hear his voice, even amid the noise of the world. It is at this moment that the narrative begins to shift, bringing into focus a man named Noah. One who would become the key not only to saving his family, but also to preserving what remained of creation. While the earth sank deeper into corruption, one man stood out, Noah. Unlike the others, he chose to walk with God, even when everyone around him preferred to mock or ignore. He was like that professional who, even in a toxic workplace, keeps his integrity and holds fast to his principles. Noah lived in days when evil seemed to be the rule, yet his life proved it was still possible to live with purpose. He was called to something greater, to build an ark. Now picture the scene, a massive ship rising on dry land while neighbors passed by and laughed. What madness, they surely said. And yet every hammer strike was an act of faith. The ark was not merely a wooden project, it was a symbol of the promise that God still desired to save. Sometimes following what God says looks foolish in human eyes, like investing time in prayer when the world tells you to run, or refusing dishonest shortcuts when everyone else seems to profit from them. But true faith proves itself precisely in the contrast. Noah not only built, he also preached. His life was a living sermon about the judgment that was coming, but the people chose to ignore it. How often does the same happen today? Warnings are given, signs are everywhere, yet humanity prefers to laugh instead of judging its own choices. Noah, however, persevered. He understood that his mission was not to convince everyone, but to obey God, and that obedience became his greatest legacy. The ark then was filled. Animals of every kind, pairs preserved by divine order, and his family. It was an act of restoration amid chaos. Creation, threatened by corruption, found refuge inside that vessel. God was writing a new chance. The promise of life had not been erased, it was simply being preserved. And so, when everything seemed ready, the doors of the ark were shut by God himself. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing would happen, until the first thunder roared and the first drops of rain fell upon the earth. Then came the day when the heavens opened and the waters began to fall without ceasing. It was not ordinary rain, but a divine judgment covering the whole earth. Underground springs burst forth, rivers overflowed, and soon all of creation seemed swallowed by chaos. Imagine standing in a city during a sudden flood. Streets vanish, houses sink, and what once felt solid dissolves into insecurity. That was the scene only on a global scale. The world that had ignored the warnings now faced the inevitable. Inside the ark, however, there was life. Animals of every kind, men and women preserved, sustained by the promise of God. With every thunderclap, Noah and his family remembered. This was not mere survival, it was salvation. The flood was not a reckless act, but a just judgment against a humanity that had chosen corruption over communion. Have you noticed how sometimes it takes storms to remind us of what truly matters? It is in those moments we learn to treasure the essential. For 40 days and 40 nights, the waters rose until they covered even the highest mountains. The silence of the earth was replaced by the unrelenting sound of rain and waves. Outside, what remained of human life was gone. Inside, the ark floated like a cradle, protecting the future of creation. It was like holding a fragile flame against fierce winds. Everything around tried to extinguish it, but God himself sustained it. And as Noah stepped out of the ark, he built an altar. The fragrance of the sacrifice rose to the heavens, and God resolved to set a lasting sign, a visible reminder of his decision. That leads us into the next scene, where the rainbow rises as the witness of the covenant. When the floodwaters finally subsided and the ark came to rest on solid ground, Noah and his family breathed with relief. The silence of the earth, now cleansed by divine justice, also carried the weight of a new beginning. What had once been corruption was now transformed into the opportunity to start again. God then not only preserved creation, but also established something greater, a promise. He resolved never again to judge the entire world with waters, and to seal this word, he painted the rainbow across the sky. The rainbow was not just a beautiful phenomenon, it was a visible reminder of divine faithfulness. Each color reflected the certainty that, despite the fall and the judgment, the heart of God always points toward salvation. It was like a contract signed before everyone, yet needing no paper or pen, the sky itself became the document, and nature its witness. Every time a storm passes and the rainbow appears, it is as if God repeats, "My promise still stands." This covenant brought with it a new sense of responsibility. After all, if God preserved, it is up to humanity to care. The same is true for us. When we receive a second chance, whether in a relationship, in our finances, or in our faith, we are called to live differently. It is not just survival, but valuing what was given. The rainbow points to this, an eternal commitment from God and a practical response from us. And it was from this new beginning that humanity once again began to multiply. But over time, the human heart leaned once more toward pride and sought to build not only cities, but a tower that would reach the heavens. Over time, the descendants of Noah spread out, but human pride began to speak louder. They decided to unite to build a city with a tower that would reach the heavens. The idea seemed grand, but the heart behind it was wrong. They were not seeking to honor creation or the promise, but to exalt themselves. It is like when a company focuses only on fame and profit, forgetting the values that sustain it. The Tower of Babel was exactly that, an attempt to create glory without God. The intention was clear: let us make a name for ourselves. And here lies the irony. While they sought eternal fame, they were digging their own downfall. How often do we see the same thing today? People sacrificing family, health, and even faith in the name of recognition. The problem was not the construction itself, but the pride that guided every brick. Deep down, it was a desire to save themselves without depending on God, and such a project inevitably had to be interrupted. God then came down to judge the work. But instead of destroying it with fire or water, he used something curious. He confused their languages. Suddenly, what was once unity became chaos. Imagine a work team where, out of nowhere, each person starts speaking a different language. Continuing the project would be impossible. The diversity of languages was born there, as a reminder that human pride always breeds division. And see how this applies to practical life as well. When values are not aligned, even people who speak the same language cannot truly understand each other. It is like a couple who both speak Portuguese, yet live in different worlds because of pride and lack of humility. The Tower of Babel shows that without divine purpose, any project is doomed to collapse, no matter how innovative it may appear. The city was left unfinished and the people scattered. But even in the midst of dispersion, God still had a plan. He did not give up on his creation. He had already chosen a specific man from a distant land to carry a promise that would change the course of all history. In the midst of a generation marked by idolatry and instability, God chose a man, Abraham. He was neither a king nor a famous warrior, but someone willing to listen. The call was direct. Leave your land, your relatives, and go to the land that I will show you. Imagine receiving such an invitation without a defined address on the map. It was not merely about changing places, but about trusting in a promise that seemed impossible. Creation, once again, found a turning point through the faith of a single heart. God promised Abraham three things: a land, a countless offspring, and that through him all nations would be blessed. In other words, through his lineage would come the plan to save. The promise was bold, for Abraham was no longer young, and his wife Sarah was barren. Humanly speaking, impossible. Yet that is precisely where faith shines. When logic says no, but trust in God answers yes. How often does this happen in our lives? When the bank account, the medical tests, or the reports declare it's over, yet faith reminds us there is still room for the extraordinary. The call of Abraham also teaches us about renunciation. He left the safety of his homeland and set out toward the unknown. It is like when someone decides to leave a stable job to venture into something new, believing there is a greater purpose at stake. It is not easy. It requires courage and a willingness to endure doubtful looks. But just like Abraham, every step of obedience opens the way to something others can only see. once it comes to pass. And as he journeyed, Abraham built altars in every place where God appeared to him. These altars were like markers of faith, visible reminders that the promise was not an invention of his mind, but a firm word. This speaks to us as well. To record victories, write down lessons, and celebrate small achievements. These signs help us remember, even in the middle of the journey, that God continues to guide. But the promise did not stop at land and descendants. The true test of faith was yet to come, on a specific mountain where the divine command would sound like an impossible paradox to accept. After years of waiting and expectation, the promise was finally fulfilled. Isaac was born, a son who brought laughter, hope, and the certainty that God is faithful to save even when everything seems impossible. Yet, just when the joy appeared complete, the greatest test arrived. God asked Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. It was as if logic itself had collapsed. After all, how could the same God who promised now ask for the very thing that represented the promise? Abraham rose early, prepared the altar, and led his son to Mount Moriah. Every step was laden with silence and trust. Think of those moments in life when you must walk without having all the answers, like when you decide to invest in a project no one believes in, or hold on to faith in a relationship that feels fragile. That walk of faith is painful, but it is also the ground where miracles bloom. The story of Abraham shows us that obedience, even without full understanding, makes room for the impossible to unfold. At the moment he lifted the knife, heaven intervened. "Do not lay a hand on the boy." God had tested Abraham's heart, and in Isaac's place, a ram was provided. That scene not only spared the son, but also pointed to something greater. One day, another son would be given, yet this time with no substitute. The ram caught in the thicket was more than an immediate solution. It was a prophetic sign of the promise of redemption that would come through Christ. The lesson is clear. True faith is not believing only when everything is going well, but remaining steadfast when logic says otherwise. It is like trusting that the seed will sprout even when nothing is yet visible beneath the soil. Abraham's obedience turned the impossible into an eternal testimony. He understood that creation was not made to live by doubt, but by trust. And from that unconsummated sacrifice, God renewed his word. The lineage would indeed come through Isaac, and the promise was reaffirmed, opening the way for the continuation of the story. After the test on Mount Moriah, God spoke again to Abraham, reaffirming the promise in an even clearer way. He swore by himself that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. It was as if the entire sky had been turned into a signed contract. This renewal was not mere repetition, but a guarantee that creation was moving toward the purpose of salvation. Abraham's heart could now rest. The future was secure. The most striking detail was that the promise would be fulfilled through Isaac, not by other means. This shows how God judges with precision and does not bargain with his plans. So often we try to help the promise with shortcuts, as in the case of Ishmael. But the renewal of the covenant reminds us that the true miracle happens God's way, not ours. It is like planting a seed. You may water it more, but only the right time brings the fruit. This covenant also carried a practical responsibility. It was not only about receiving blessings, but about living in such a way that the world could see the difference. It is like when someone earns a diploma. It is not just to hang on the wall, but to use that knowledge for the benefit of others. In the same way, Abraham and his descendants had the mission to reflect the divine character before the nations. The promise was not a selfish privilege, but a calling to serve. And here lies something precious. With every renewal, God not only reminded Abraham of his word, but also strengthened his faith. The same happens with us. How many times do we read the same passage of Scripture and suddenly it speaks in a new way? or hear an old song that reignites our hope. These are renewed covenants, living reminders that heaven is still active in our story. But not everyone would receive the promise with the same spirit. Even Isaac's own family would face deep tensions, showing how blessing can clash with the human heart. 2 brothers would be born, carrying with them a struggle that would echo for generations. Isaac and Rebekah had twins, Esau and Jacob, but even from the womb there was conflict. Esau was born first, strong and skilled in hunting, while Jacob came out holding his brother's heel, as if already contending for the birthright. That opening scene revealed the contrast that would mark their lives. It is striking how at times siblings raised in the same home, under the same upbringing, can take such different paths. The promise of God rested upon Jacob, yet the journey for it to unfold would be filled with tension. Esau valued the immediate, hunts, pleasures, and whatever gave him satisfaction in the moment. Jacob, on the other hand, sought what had lasting value, though often in questionable ways. The episode of selling the birthright is emblematic. For a bowl of lentil stew, Esau gave up something eternal. It is like when someone trades years of building for a fleeting pleasure, a promising career abandoned for an addiction, or a strong marriage destroyed by an impulsive decision. Their story makes us reflect on how we judge the worth of things in our own lives. Later, with his mother's help, Jacob deceived his aging father and received the blessing of the firstborn. The act was marked by cunning, but also by painful consequences. The family was divided, trust was broken, and Jacob had to flee. This shows that even when God's promise is certain, the wrong means of pursuing it can bring sorrow. How often do we try to speed up God's plan and end up complicating everything? It's like picking a fruit before its time. It exists, but it does not yet have the flavor it should. And yet, in the midst of failures and victories, the promise was not annulled. God did not give up on Jacob, because his word does not depend on human perfection, but on divine faithfulness. The moral fall of men never surpasses God's desire to save. Jacob fled carrying not only fear, but also a calling that still needed to be revealed. And it was precisely in his flight, when he seemed alone and directionless, that Jacob had an unexpected encounter, a dream where heaven and earth were connected through a mysterious ladder. In his flight, Jacob lay down in an ordinary place, using a stone as his pillow. There, in the silence of the night, God chose to reveal himself in an extraordinary way, a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. This vision was more than a dream. It was a reminder that even in the midst of the fall, the promise remained alive. God had not abandoned Jacob. It is like when someone feels lost on a journey without a map, but suddenly receives a clear GPS signal showing that the destination still exists. The ladder showed that creation was never disconnected from the Creator. There was movement between the divine and the human, open communication, constant care. This shatters the idea that we are alone. Even today, that dream stands as a symbol that God is active, sending invisible resources on our behalf. Have you ever thought about how many times you were spared from something without even realizing it? A delay that kept you from an accident, a no that made room for a better yes. All of these are echoes of that invisible ladder. In the dream, God spoke to Jacob, reaffirming the promise made to Abraham and Isaac. Through you and your descendants, all the families of the earth will be blessed. In other words, even while fleeing because of his mistakes, Jacob still carried a calling. This shows us that God does not judge only the present. He sees the future. He sees beyond deceit, beyond the fall, beyond insecurity. It is like a teacher who sees the potential in a rebellious student and persists until he becomes a reference point for others. When Jacob awoke, he declared, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He then set up the stone as a memorial, anointing it with oil. That act is powerful. turning a moment of vulnerability into an altar of encounter. We can do the same. When we experience something significant, instead of just moving on, we can record it, write it down, or create symbols that remind us of the promise. In this way, the heart does not forget that even in deserts, there are signs of heaven. But Jacob's story would not end with dreams. Ahead awaited a night of intensity, where he would not only see angels, but wrestle with one in a struggle that would forever change his identity. Jacob, now grown and about to meet his brother Esau again, carried with him fear, guilt, and uncertainty. That night, alone by the banks of the Jabbok River, he was surprised by a mysterious struggle. It was not an ordinary enemy, but a celestial being. The scene is intense, hours of confrontation, sweat, pain, and resistance. This battle represented more than physical strength. It was the reflection of years in which Jacob tried to succeed in life through cunning. How often do we also insist on solving everything by force, without depending on God? As the night wore on, Jacob clung to the angel with all his strength. Even wounded in the hip, he would not let go. This attitude reveals something powerful. There are moments when, in order to change your life, you must hold on until the very end. It is like the entrepreneur who spends sleepless nights to see his project come to life, or someone who wrestles in prayer for their family until help finally arrives. Jacob understood. The blessing would not be won through trickery, but received through perseverance before God. Then came the turning point. The angel asked his name. "Jacob," he replied, and there he confessed his identity as a deceiver. But in that very moment, God transformed him into Israel, the one who wrestles with God and prevails. A new name, a new destiny. This reminds us that we are not defined by the mistakes of our past, but by the promise God speaks over us. The fall is never the final word. Renewal always comes. Jacob left limping, but with a new heart. Sometimes the mark of a wound is the very seal of transformation. To onlookers, he might have seemed to stumble, but in truth, every step was a testimony that God had changed his story. The same is true for us. Scars can be reminders of pain, but they can also become trophies of overcoming. What once appeared weakness becomes proof of strength. And it was as Israel that Jacob moved forward, prepared not only to lead his family, but to become the father of an entire people. A people who would be born through his sons, forming the 12 tribes that would carry the promise. The life of Jacob, now called Israel, was marked by multiplication. From his relationships came 12 sons, each with strong personalities and their own stories. These sons were not merely children in a large family, but seeds of something far greater, the 12 tribes of Israel. Each tribe would carry not only a name, but also a destiny within the promise. It is like a company made up of various departments, each with its own role, yet all serving one central purpose. The relationships among these brothers, however, were far from peaceful. Jealousy, rivalry, and comparisons constantly arose. Jacob's favoritism, especially toward Joseph, only heightened the tension. This shows us that even in families chosen by God, human challenges remain. It is like the modern family, where siblings compete for their parents' attention or for the inheritance. Yet even within all this conflict, the promise remained active. Creation might be scarred by failures, but the plan to save still moved forward. What is most fascinating is that despite their flaws, these 12 men became historical foundations. Each tribe in the future would hold an essential role in the story of Israel, some in leadership, others in service, yet all necessary. This reminds us that it is not perfection that sustains purpose, but God's faithfulness. Have you ever thought of that applied to your own life? Perhaps you see yourself full of flaws, yet still an essential part of something greater, something that can only be fulfilled with your participation. The family of Jacob was at once a mirror of human weakness and a sign of divine grace. Where there was a fall, there was also room for transformation. Where there was conflict, God was writing redemption. And among these brothers, one in particular would rise to prominence, not because of his strength, but because of the purpose God had placed upon his life. Joseph, the beloved son. Among the 12 sons, Joseph stood out not only because of his father's preference, but also because of the dreams he carried. Jacob gave him a colorful robe, a symbol of affection and distinction, yet this stirred envy in his brothers. It is striking how the creation of something beautiful can, at the same time, expose the worst in the human heart. Who has not seen someone criticized simply for shining? Joseph, with youthful innocence, shared his dreams without measuring the consequences, and those dreams pointed to a future where he would be exalted. The brothers, consumed by envy, decided to judge him harshly. At first, they planned to kill him. Later, they sold him as a slave instead. The scene is heavy, the beloved son thrown into a pit, betrayed by those closest to him. It is like when someone faces betrayal from within their own family or circle of trust. Often, the deepest pain does not come from declared enemies, but from familiar hands. Joseph tasted this fall, yet he did not lose the promise God had placed upon his life. The robe, stained with blood, was taken back to Jacob, who wept, believing his son was dead. Meanwhile, Joseph was carried off to Egypt, far from his home and everything he knew. It was the beginning of a harsh journey, yet one that would reveal a far greater plan. That is how God works. What appears to be tragedy can be the very path to salvation. How many times in life do we walk through closed doors that later prove to be shortcuts toward greater destinies? The story of Joseph teaches us that God's love does not spare us from pain, but prepares us for great purposes. The son rejected by his brothers would one day become the instrument to preserve that very family. The promise remained firm, even when it seemed extinguished. And it was in Egypt, a land of strange gods and different systems, that Joseph would learn to remain faithful. Even in the face of betrayals, injustices and temptations soon to come. Taken as a slave into Egypt, Joseph could have surrendered to bitterness. Yet even in a foreign land, he maintained his faith and integrity. In Potiphar's house, he worked with excellence and soon gained trust. It is like that employee who, even in unfair conditions, chooses to give their best, knowing that character is worth more than circumstance. Joseph understood that God's promise did not depend on where he was, but on who he was. But not everything was easy. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, and instead of giving in, Joseph chose to flee. That decision cost him his freedom. He was falsely accused and thrown into prison. Here we see a crucial point. Sometimes choosing what is right does not bring applause, but judgment and loss. How many have faced the same? People who, by refusing to lie, lost deals, or by remaining faithful, suffered rejection. Joseph teaches us that integrity is worth more than quick results. In prison once again, Joseph refused to be crushed. He interpreted dreams and helped others, showing that even in the darkest place, he could still be light. This reminds us that the environment does not need to define who we are. You can live in a small room and still dream big. You can lack resources and still create solutions. The secret is not letting the fall extinguish hope. Even while unjustly condemned, Joseph lived as one who knew that God was still in control. It was as if every hardship was training for what was to come. He learned to manage small situations so that one day he could govern great nations. That is a practical lesson. Do not despise the little you have today, for it may be the foundation for something extraordinary tomorrow. And it was precisely from prison that Joseph's story began to change. An unexpected encounter with Pharaoh would open doors no one imagined, revealing how God can turn entire pages in just a matter of days. Time passed, and Pharaoh had troubling dreams that no one could interpret. Then someone remembered Joseph, the young Hebrew prisoner, yet full of wisdom. Brought before the throne, he listened to the dreams and clearly revealed their meaning. 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. More than interpreting, Joseph presented a strategy: store up during the years of plenty to survive the years of scarcity. It's like one who knows how to invest well in times of prosperity in order to reap security in the future. The creation of a wise plan saved not only Egypt, but the surrounding world as well. Pharaoh, impressed, saw in no one else such an excellent spirit, and so the wronged slave was exalted to governor, receiving authority over all the land of Egypt. The contrast is striking, from prison to palace in a single day. This shows us how God can turn destinies around suddenly. A forgotten resume can become an unexpected promotion. An overlooked project can become a worldwide reference. The promise always finds the right moment to be fulfilled. Joseph used his position not for revenge, but for salvation. During the famine, he opened the storehouses and fed entire nations. His faithfulness not only transformed his own life, but preserved countless others. That is the power of living with purpose. Your choices reach far more people than you imagine. Think of it: when you choose integrity, love, forgiveness, or excellence in your work, the impact extends far beyond your immediate circle. And even clothed in Egyptian authority, Joseph never forgot who he was or who had sustained him. Every decision was marked by the awareness that his story was not about the fall, but about the promise. God had placed him there not by chance, but to be an instrument of salvation in a time of crisis. And it was precisely this famine that brought his brothers to Egypt, never imagining they would meet again the one they had once sold. The stage was set for one of the most emotional scenes in history: Joseph's reunion with his family. The famine also reached the land of Canaan, and Joseph's brothers went down to Egypt in search of food. They had no idea that the powerful governor standing before them was the very brother they had sold years earlier. The scene is filled with tension. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. It was like meeting again the very ones who had wounded you deeply. Only now you have the chance to respond. Joseph's heart could choose to judge with vengeance or to save with forgiveness. He tested them, not out of cruelty, but to see if they had changed. He asked them to bring Benjamin, the youngest brother, and observed how they would act. Unlike the past, the brothers showed repentance and a willingness to protect one another. That detail is profound. The fall had taught them, and their hearts were no longer the same. How often does life use crises to transform our character? What once was selfishness was now becoming care. When he could no longer hold back his tears, Joseph revealed himself. "I am Joseph, your brother." Shock struck them instantly. Fear overwhelmed them, but Joseph's response was astonishing. He did not seek revenge. Instead, he declared that everything was part of God's plan. "It was not you who sent me here, but God, to save many lives." Here the promise shines. Even pain had been used as a bridge to redemption. The reunion was not merely family, it was spiritual. Creation had been wounded by envy and betrayal, but now it was restored through forgiveness and reconciliation. Joseph brought his whole family into Egypt, ensuring their sustenance in the time of famine. The cycle was complete. The rejected son had become the savior of his own brothers. This teaches us that sometimes the very place of our deepest pain can become the stage of our greatest victory. And so, from Adam to Joseph, the story of Genesis reveals a single thread. Even in the face of the fall, God always kept his promise alive, with the ultimate purpose to save. Now that you've journeyed from creation to salvation, From Eden to Joseph's reunion with his brothers, the question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Because this is not just about ancient stories, but living signs for your life today. If God turned the fall into a promise, if he raised hope in the midst of judgment, if he used betrayal to bring salvation, can he not also change your story? The great question is, how long will you keep trying to handle everything on your own? In every chapter of Genesis, we see that when man chooses pride, the fall is inevitable. But when he chooses to trust, even the impossible becomes reality. And so I challenge you, which side will you stand on? The tower that collapses or the promise that endures? Think about your choices, about the areas that need rebuilding, the relationships that need forgiveness, the dreams that seem asleep. This is your chance to apply what you've learned, to turn theory into practice. Maybe this is the moment to raise an altar in your life, not of stone, but of decision. And I want to invite you, don't let this journey end here. Keep learning, growing, and being challenged by the Word. And for that, it's simple. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on. That way, you won't miss the next chapters of this series, and you can keep walking with me on this journey of faith and transformation.